Night over Eastern Europe is never truly dark anymore. Radar screens glow like constellations, diesel engines purr in bunker caverns, and above the front, the sky is stitched with contrails and the brief, hard flash of interceptors. But tonight, there's a new rumour running along the trenches, a line on the map that feels more like a fuse. The United States is weighing whether to put Tomahawk cruise missiles in Ukrainian hands. A weapon born for deep strikes over oceans and deserts, suddenly whispered about on the plains of Kharkiv. When you turn a castle into a target range, the game changes, and the walls of Russia's castle run very, very deep. The story began, at least publicly, when US Vice President JD Vance said Washington was considering Kyiv's request to acquire Tomahawks, potentially via a deal that allows European allies to buy them and pass them on. President Donald Trump added his own twist days later. He'd want to know Ukraine's plan for the missiles before approving anything, a nod toward escalation worries even as the door stayed conspicuously ajar. It's Washington hedging the match, keeping the lighter close, but not quite striking it. For Ukraine, the logic is obvious. Tomahawks are long-range, terrain-hugging cruise missiles designed to punch deep into a foe's critical infrastructure from standoff distance. Depending on variant and flight profile, the range stretches to roughly 2,500 kilometers, enough to put most of European Russia under a ruler, Moscow included, from Ukrainian launch points. If Kyiv gets them, power stations, command hubs, airbases, and ammunition depots far behind Russia's front could go from safe rear area to please update the evacuation plan. That is the point. That is why the Kremlin calls this a red line. Let's ground the hype in hardware. The Tomahawk Land Attack Missile is a 6-meter subsonic, precision-guided cruise missile. It flies low, think hedge skimming low, using a guidance stack that has evolved from terrain contour matching and DSMAC scene matching to GPS and two-way data linking in later blocks. Warheads vary, but a 450-kilogram class unitary charge is standard for land attack. The missile can reroute mid-flight and swarm in coordinated time-on-target waves that overwhelm defenses, not by speed, but by cunning. It is usually fired from ships and submarines through vertical launch cells, but there are, crucially, land launch options that have been prototyped and fielded in limited numbers. In other words, this isn't magic. It's geometry, software, and a lot of practice. That last point, how to launch, is where the operational picture gets interesting for Ukraine. No one sane is proposing to hand Kyiv US destroyers, but the United States Marine Corps built a ground launcher concept for Tomahawk tied to its expeditionary long-range fires experiments. Those long-range fires, LRF/NMESIS derived launchers, now slated for retirement and re-roll in FY 2026, because Marines need something with better beach mobility, mean there are a small number of surplus adjacent launch solutions that, in theory, could be adapted for Ukraine far faster than building new systems from scratch. It won't be pretty, but in war, works by Wednesday beats perfect by Christmas. Of course, while Kyiv sketches arcs on the map, Moscow sketches threats. Within hours of the Tomahawk chatter spiking, Andrei Kartopolov, the former deputy defense minister who now chairs the Duma's Defense Committee, warned that Russia would not only shoot down Tomahawks, but also strike the launch sites that fired them. In other words, you fire, we erase the hand that pulled the trigger. It's classic counter-battery logic applied to deep strike weapons. It's also classic messaging, a reminder to any host nation that basing matters, and that retaliation may not respect the neat borders of a battlefield. Vladimir Putin went further. Supplying Tomahawks, he said, would shatter US-Russia relations and escalate the war into a qualitatively new stage. That's not subtle. It's the Kremlin signaling that deep strike parity, Ukraine's ability to hold Russian heartland targets at regular risk, crosses the line from painful to unacceptable. Whether you read this as deterrence or bluff depends on how many nights you've spent counting interceptors over Belgorod. But it's also a reminder that strategy isn't only about what you can hit. It's about what your adversary thinks you'll dare to hit. Meanwhile, in Washington, the cold math of inventory and priorities intruded. US officials told Reuters that, despite the headline debate, Tomahawk shipments remain unlikely because much of the inventory is committed to Navy use. and production capacity is already spoken for in out-year buys. In other words, even if the White House wants to, the magazines that matter are bolted into the decks of real ships sailing real patrols in the Pacific. Short-range alternatives and other long-range options might be on the table, but Tomahawks specifically are constrained by stock and schedule. That's not sexy, but it's decisive. Logistics always is.
And yet, politics and procurement have workarounds. One path mirrors how other sensitive weapons slipped into the war. Allow European partners to purchase US munitions and transfer them onward, masked by the prioritized Ukraine requirements list and the quiet efficiency that mechanism has developed. The Pentagon can also bolster Ukraine's long-range effects in the near term by sharing targeting intelligence, energy infrastructure maps, logistics bottlenecks, and air defense coverage gaps, so Ukraine's existing drones and missiles bite harder. It's not the same as a 2,500-kilometer missile, but if you can't buy a sword, sharpening the spear you already hold is the next best thing. On the Ukrainian side, the strategic calculus is simple and brutal. Deep strike reach creates choices. With Tomahawks in the quiver, Kyiv could synchronize blows well behind the line of contact, cracking electrical nodes that feed rail hubs, flipping S-300/400 radar sites into smoking holes hours before an armored push, forcing aircraft to abandon forward bases, and creating a drumbeat of disruption that erodes Russia's war tempo. If the front is a wall, deep strikes are the termites. You don't see the damage in real time. One morning, the structure just sags. When you turn a castle into target range, the game changes. It's not a joke in Ukraine, it's Tuesday. But range cuts both ways. A missile that can reach Moscow can also invite Moscow's worst reflexes. Kartapilov's promise to hit launch sites is straightforward enough. The more unsettling prospect is horizontal escalation. Cyber campaigns against European grids that house launchers, naval harassment in the Black Sea, or a surge of standoff strikes to punish cities, hoping to peel allies away through fear and fatigue. The Kremlin has been running what analysts call a reflexive control scare campaign for months, flooding the infosphere with warnings meant to preempt Western deliveries. It's strategic theater with a dangerous finale. Let's also be honest about the intercept game. Russia has shot at Tomahawks in Syria and claims to know their flight habits. It has layered defenses, Pantsir point systems, Buk medium range, S-300/400 long range, and a good feel for its own radar shadows. None of that makes a deep strike cruise missile useless. The Tomahawk was built to bend around radar, hug terrain, and arrive from unexpected bearings. But it does mean that survivability depends on planning, timing, deception, and volume. 10 missiles hurled at a single bunker is a headline. 10 missiles sequenced across a dozen substations at 4 in the morning is strategy. This is chess at 550 knots. And then there's the numbers problem. Tomahawks are not infinite and not cheap, and Russia knows it. Even Moscow's taunts admit the most likely scenario is delivery in tens rather than hundreds, which matters because deep strike campaigns work best as sustained pressure, not single fireworks nights. Volume is a tactic all its own. You don't need a PhD to see the bind. The longer the war drags, the more a finite cruise missile stock must be husbanded for potential contingencies far from Ukraine. The US Navy buys Tomahawks for more than one scenario, and Taiwan's map lives on the same desk as Ukraine's. Still, new launch options nibble at the how question. If ground launchers from the Marine Corps' long-range fires experiment are available to repurpose, integration and training become the pacing items rather than ship transfers. It's wiring harnesses, software loads, crew drills, and camouflage plans, not naval paperwork. Ukraine has become ruthlessly efficient at fielding odd-couple systems. Their army is the world's most creative Lego kit, so a modest launcher pipeline could translate into real, if limited, strike capacity within months. The glamour is low, the payoff is high. Where do the Allies stand in all of this? Publicly, they're reading the same tea leaves as everyone else. Privately, capitals have been recalculating since the first swarms of drones blacked out Kyiv's neighborhoods again this autumn. The AP's wire copy about another heavy night of Russian strikes carried a telling footnote. Vance confirming the Tomahawk review was underway. That's not random.
It's the kind of small breadcrumb officials drop when they want deterrence to do some of the lifting before the procurement does. It says to Moscow, imagine your winter if Ukraine has reach. It says to Kyiv, keep breathing. Help may change shape. Russia, for its part, is trying to hold two ideas at once. Promise to smash the missiles on their launchers, and promise that the missiles won't matter even if they arrive. Those lines are aimed at different audiences. The first is for NATO, be warned. The second is for domestic morale, be reassured. Both are familiar, and both reflect a genuine vulnerability. The Russian war machine relies on depth, distance as armor, rails as arteries, electricity as lifeblood. Tomahawks don't win a war overnight, but they make distance bleed. Let's talk risks, because this channel respects the audience. Putting Tomahawks in play would force Ukraine to master a new kill chain, target development, deconfliction with other strike assets, electromagnetic deception, and battle damage assessment across very long distances. It would force Europe to harden any basing or storage nodes tied to the system. And it would force Washington to decide how far its fingerprints should show: intelligence support, mission planning software, maintenance advisors. That's the ladder of involvement the Kremlin keeps pointing at. And it's not wrong that every rung climbed is harder to climb down from. But consider the alternative. The war already features Russian barrages that black out cities and shatter apartment blocks. It already features Ukrainian drones flying 1,000 kilometers to torch oil depots and nick the myth of sanctuary. The question is not whether the war is long range. It is. The question is who holds the more accurate, repeatable bat. Tomahawks would not end the war. They would, however, give Kyiv a tool to impose real costs on Russia's depth and to time those costs with its own operations. Wars end when somebody's math breaks. Deep strikes are math crushers. In the end, the US decision will hinge on three vectors. First, capacity. Can the Pentagon spare inventory without undercutting Pacific and CENTCOM needs? Second, credibility. Does signaling fall flat if you posture and then balk? Third, control. Can Washington bound escalation with rules of use and basing arrangements that deter reckless retaliation? This is deterrence by calibration, the art of giving enough power to change behavior without handing a match to the wind. It's not easy, it never is. So here's the straight talk for a war-weary audience. If Tomahawks arrive even in small batches, Ukraine gains leverage it has lacked since 2022. The ability to make the Russian home front feel military consequences predictably and at scale. Expect the first targets to be military logistics and air defense nodes, not symbols. Expect the Kremlin to answer with bluster, cyber, and perhaps a sharp but contained flurry of strikes. Expect Europe to check its generator fuel and its rail junctions. And expect, above all, a subtler shift. Russian commanders looking over their shoulders, planners allocating more to defense than offense, politicians learning that rear area no longer means safe. When distance stops being armor, doctrine stops being comfortable. If the missiles don't arrive, the story doesn't end. Washington can still bend the battlefield with better targeting data, faster munition cycles, and political cover for allies sending what they already have. Ukraine will keep flying drones long and low, keep hunting the cables and transformers that feed the Russian war machine, keep turning surprise into a strategy. And Moscow will keep warning about lines even as it redraws them with each night raid. But the absence of Tomahawks will be felt in the cadence of Ukraine's offensives, in the confidence of its partners, and in the Kremlin's growing belief that time remains on its side. One last note on the weapon itself, because myths matter. Tomahawks are not invincible. They're relentless. They win by planning, by numbers, and by forcing an enemy to spend $3 million in interceptors to stop a missile that costs less than that to fire. If you need a joke to keep the hand steady, think of Tomahawk like a very patient lawnmower. It doesn't sprint. It trims and trims and trims until the field looks different. Russia can shout at the grass. The blades don't care. The credits are still rolling on this act. JD Vance says the review is live. Trump says he's sort of decided. Putin says the sky will fall. Kartopolov says the launchers will too.
Europe whispers about procurement pathways while Ukrainian planners sketch circles they've never been allowed to draw. Somewhere, a sergeant on a cold steppe stares at a radio and wonders if the winter will sound different this time. That's the calculus of escalation and deterrence. Not fireworks, but choices. Not headlines, but habits. Whether Tomahawks arrive or not, the question that will decide this war's trajectory is the same as it was on day one. Who can change the other side's behavior faster than the other side can adapt? Deep range is one way to force that change. Deep resolve is the other. And history says wars are won when a country can wield both with a steady hand. Because when you turn a castle into a target range, the game changes. The only question is, who gets to call range hot?